The wind howled against the glass, carrying the hum of a city that never looked up. Far above the streets, a woman clung to a window pane with a baby strapped to her chest. One wrong move away from disaster. Inside, a man who had everything was about to discover that one act of courage could change every life it touched. The morning sun poured like liquid gold over the glass towers of the city. Its reflections danced across polished windows and steel beams, illuminating the quiet rhythm of another ambitious day. Inside the top floor of one of those towers, Adrian Costa sat behind a sleek oak desk, his pen gliding across a line of contracts worth millions. He was the kind of man people saw only through news headlines. Wealthy, composed, unreachable. Yet beneath that surface of success, silence echoed through the marble halls of his penthouse. Silence, and a kind of loneliness that even his fortune couldn't buy away. As Adrian looked up from the last page, something flickered in the corner of his eye. Movement. Faint but out of place, outside the glass wall that framed the city skyline. He stood, curiosity tugging at him, and approached the window. There, 50 meters above the ground, a woman moved with careful precision, wiping down the towering glass panels. Sunlight caught the strands of her dark hair and the faint shimmer of sweat along her brow. But what froze him wasn't her presence. It was the small bundle strapped to her chest. A baby. Fast asleep, its tiny hand clutching at her uniform, Adrian's pulse quickened. He had seen window cleaners before, but never one balancing between life and death while protecting another life so small. He stepped closer, pressing his hand to the glass. The woman, Aisha, adjusted her harness, humming softly to calm her child. The melody, muffled by the city's hum, somehow reached Adrian through the thick pane. It was a lullaby, the kind only a mother with no one else to rely on could sing. Then, without warning, came the sound. A sharp, gut-turning snap. One of the safety lines jerked free, recoiling like a whip. Aisha screamed, not for herself, but for the baby pressed against her heart. Her body swung outward, her hand clawing for grip on the remaining rope. Adrian's breath caught. Instinct took over before logic could form. He raced toward the emergency latch, slammed it open, and the gust of wind hit him like a wall. "Hold on!" he shouted, though his voice was swallowed by the roar of the wind and the height beneath them. Aisha's eyes met his for a split second, wide, terrified, pleading, and something inside him broke. He grabbed a spare security line from the maintenance rack near the window, anchored it around a beam, and threw it out toward her. The rope whipped through the air, missing once, twice before Aisha managed to grasp it with trembling fingers. Adrian hauled with all his strength, muscles burning, the weight of 2 lives pulling against gravity itself. Every second stretched longer than a heartbeat. When he finally pulled her inside, both of them collapsed to the marble floor, gasping, shaking, and drenched in fear. The baby cried, and Aisha pressed her cheek against the child's head, whispering prayers of gratitude. Adrian sat across from her, chest heaving, trying to steady his thoughts. She looked up, eyes glistening with tears, and managed to say between sobs, "I had no choice. The daycare closed last week. I can't afford anyone to watch her. I have to work, sir. I have to." Her voice cracked, and in that moment Adrian saw through the layers of exhaustion and desperation. This wasn't just a woman fighting for survival. She was someone holding her world together with nothing but courage. The boardroom deals, the contracts, the luxury that filled his life suddenly felt small, fragile. Before he could respond, the sound of soft footsteps broke the silence. His young son, Ethan, stood in the doorway, pale, quiet, eyes curious. It had been 6 months since the boy had spoken. 6 months since he'd lost his mother, retreating into a world of silence no doctor or therapist could reach. Now, he stared at Aisha, then at the tiny baby still sniffling in her arms. Without a word, Ethan walked forward and knelt beside them. His hand reached out carefully and brushed the baby's foot. The child kicked, and a faint giggle escaped its lips. Something miraculous happened in that instant. A sound Adrian hadn't heard in months. A laugh, soft, uncertain, but real. Ethan was smiling. The first real smile since his mother's funeral. Adrian's throat tightened. He turned away slightly, blinking against the sting in his eyes. Aisha noticed the change in the boy and whispered, "He's got a kind soul." Adrian nodded, unable to find words. The weight of everything, the near tragedy, the miracle, the rediscovery of something human, settled over him like dawn breaking after a storm. For years, he had been surrounded by people chasing power, deals, and numbers. Yet this woman, this struggling mother dangling above death for the sake of her child, had reminded him what courage truly looked like. As Aisha rocked her baby, Ethan stayed beside her, transfixed, as if afraid that if he blinked, she might vanish. Adrian watched them both and felt something stir deep within, the faint echo of purpose, of connection, something he thought money had replaced long ago. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware that high above its streets, two lives had collided in a single act of bravery, and in the heart of a penthouse that once echoed with emptiness. The first fragile spark of warmth had returned. The penthouse, once a shrine of silence and sterile perfection, began to breathe again. Morning light filtered through the high glass windows, catching the faint scent of coffee and something sweet on the stove. It was no longer just Adrian's home. It was beginning to sound like life. After the rescue, he couldn't let Aisha return to dangling off skyscrapers with her baby tied to her chest. The image haunted him, so he made her an offer that surprised even himself. "Come work here," he said softly. "Help me with my son. Bring your baby." "I think we all could use a little saving," Aisha hesitated. Pride warred with gratitude in her eyes. She wasn't used to kindness that didn't come with strings. But when she looked at Ethan, sitting silently by the window drawing with crayons, she saw something fragile, something worth helping grow. "If you're sure," she said finally, her voice trembling, "I'll do my best." Adrian smiled, not with the polished charm of a businessman, but with quiet relief. Days turned into weeks, and the mansion that once echoed with the hum of machines now carried the laughter of children. Aisha would hum in the kitchen while making pancakes, her baby Noah gurgling in his high chair. Ethan began to follow her around like a shadow. At first, he only watched, silent, curious, but slowly, the silence cracked. One morning, when Aisha dropped a spoon and muttered, "Oh dear," Ethan giggled, a sound that made Adrian stop mid-call and listen. From then on, it was as if the boy had found a new rhythm to his heart. He began to speak softly at first, then with growing confidence, asking Aisha about songs, about Noah's toys, it's about pancakes. Adrian would stand at the doorway some mornings watching the two children play, watching Aisha's patience and warmth fill the cold spaces of his home. For the first time since his wife's passing, he felt something close to peace. He started coming home early, leaving meetings unfinished, drawn to the sound of laughter instead of the endless clinking of glasses at corporate dinners. But beneath that warmth, a shadow grew. Margaret, the mother of Adrian's late wife, watched everything from a distance. She visited often, draped in expensive pearls and a permanent frown. To her, Aisha was an intruder, a replacement for the daughter she'd adored. Each time she saw Aisha holding baby Noah near the piano, or Ethan reaching for her hand, bitterness twisted deeper into her heart. At first, her disapproval was silent, tight smiles and cold glances. But soon it began to take shape in words. "How lovely," she said one afternoon, her tone dripping with disdain, "to see the new nanny fitting in so well. Almost like family." Aisha froze, unsure how to respond. Adrian caught the edge in Margaret's voice but chose to ignore it. He told himself she was just grieving in her own way. Over the next few weeks, little things began to shift. A vase went missing and reappeared in Aisha's room. Silverware was found misplaced, and whispers started among the household staff. "Maybe she's not as innocent as she looks," Margaret would murmur, just loud enough to be overheard. Aisha, unwilling to cause trouble, said nothing, but the warmth in her smile dimmed. She began walking more carefully, speaking more softly, as if her very presence needed permission to exist. One morning, Margaret invited her to a lunch with her wealthy friends. "It'll be good for you to meet some refined company," she said sweetly, though her eyes betrayed another intent. Aisha, always respectful, agreed. She wore her cleanest dress, fixed her hair, and hoped to make a good impression. But the luncheon turned into a slow, cruel spectacle. The women asked her where she learned to speak so well, whether her kind usually worked with babies, and Margaret laughed, calling her the brave little nanny who saved Adrian's window. The laughter that followed wasn't friendly. It was sharp, cold, and deliberate. Aisha smiled through it, her hands clasped in her lap, heart thudding with humiliation. She excused herself early, walking home with her baby strapped close, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. By the time she reached the penthouse, she felt hollow. She didn't knock, just stepped inside, set Noah down, and whispered to the empty air, "They made me feel like I shouldn't exist." Adrian heard her. He'd just come out of a meeting, but the sound of her voice cut deeper than any business matter ever could. He approached her carefully, seeing the tears she was trying to hide. "You shouldn't have gone," he said gently, handing her a glass of water. "They don't see the world the way you do." Her hands trembled as she took it. "I just wanted to be seen as more than what they think I am," she said quietly. "But no matter how hard I try, people like them will always see the dirt on my shoes before they see the work in my hands." Adrian's jaw tightened. He'd lived in that world all his life, the world that judged by last names and bank balances. But standing before her, he felt shame, not for her, but for the blindness of his own kind. "Aisha," he said softly, "the world loves to look down on strength when it comes from someone they expect to kneel, but don't you dare let them make you smaller." She looked up, eyes glistening, and for a moment, the distance between their worlds vanished. There was just understanding. Two people shaped by loss trying to hold together what life had broken. Outside, the city glimmered in the fading light, unaware that within those high walls, a different kind of courage was quietly surviving, the courage to keep showing up in a world determined to make you invisible. The days that followed blurred into a quiet unease. The penthouse, once full of soft laughter and small miracles, began to tremble under the weight of something darker. Aisha still cooked in the mornings, still sang to Noah while folding laundry, but her smile no longer reached her eyes. Adrian felt it too, a strange distance creeping between moments of calm. It was as if the walls themselves knew that peace had been borrowed, not earned, and it didn't take long for the storm to find its way in. Margaret arrived one afternoon, dressed in black silk and indignation. Her perfume filled the air before her words did. She placed a sleek folder on Adrian's table, her expression tight with self-righteous fury. "You needed to know the truth," she said coolly. "About that woman." Adrian frowned, already uneasy. Margaret slid the folder toward him. "I had her investigated. You should see for yourself who she really is." Inside were photographs, old records, and a typed report from a private investigator. It painted Aisha as a woman who had supposedly been involved with a married man, who had trapped him with a pregnancy, and who was now using her child to gain sympathy and access to Adrian's wealth. Margaret's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "She's not who you think she is, Adrian. She's a fraud, a danger to your family's name." Aisha, standing in the doorway with her hands still wet from washing dishes, froze at the sound. Her breath caught and color drained from her face. "That's not true," she said softly. Margaret turned, eyes glinting with triumph. "Then tell him, dear. Tell him who the father really is." The room seemed to shrink as Aisha tried to find her words. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "It's true that I loved a man who wasn't mine. He told me he was single, that he wanted to build a life with me. I believed him. When I found out he had a wife and children, I left. I never wanted anything from him. But by then, I was already pregnant." She swallowed hard, her gaze fixed on the floor. "My parents said I brought shame to our name. They closed their doors on me. I had nowhere to go." Adrian said nothing. The papers lay between them like a wall. His mind raced, logic against emotion, doubt against compassion. He wanted to believe her, every word, but the seed of suspicion Margaret had planted had already taken root. He'd been fooled before, manipulated by people who wore honesty like a mask. What if he was making the same mistake again? Margaret watched the hesitation flicker in his eyes, and that was all she needed. That night she made her final move. When the household was quiet, She slipped into Aisha's room and placed something small and glittering inside the pocket of her bag, a diamond necklace that had been missing from her collection for weeks. The next morning, her voice rang through the hall. "My necklace! It's gone again!" Her cry drew everyone's attention. The staff searched, room by room, until one of the maids lifted Aisha's bag and gasped. The necklace glimmered from inside, innocent as a snake waiting to strike. A hush fell. Adrian stepped forward, confusion clouding his face. "Aisha, how did this get here?" Her lips parted, trembling. "I didn't take it," she whispered. "I swear I didn't." Margaret sighed dramatically, hand to her chest. "Of course you didn't, dear. These things just walk into your bag on their own, don't they?" Adrian looked from Aisha to Margaret, torn apart by doubt. He wanted to defend her, but his silence stretched too long, and that silence, his hesitation, was all it took to break her heart. Tears filled her eyes, but her voice stayed steady. "You think I could steal from the only home that ever showed me kindness?" She picked up Noah, clutching him to her chest. "I've made mistakes, Adrian, but lying was never one of them. I thought you saw that." She turned away before he could speak. Ethan came running from his room, crying, "Don't go! Please don't go!" But Aisha was already at the door, her tears falling as silently as his. When the elevator doors closed, the sound that followed was unbearable. Ethan's sobs echoing through the marble halls. That night he refused to eat, refused to talk. It was as if all the progress, all the healing had vanished with the woman who had brought light into his world. Adrian wandered through the house like a ghost, haunted by his own doubt. Every room felt colder, emptier, as if the air itself had turned against him. Days later, unable to bear the silence any longer, he went searching. He found her in a rundown apartment on the city's edge, paint peeling from the walls, a single lamp flickering weakly in the corner. Aisha opened the door, surprise and pain flashing across her face. Noah sat on the floor, playing with a broken toy. "Aisha," Adrian said quietly, "come back, please. Ethan hasn't spoken since you left. He barely eats. He needs you." She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "And what about me, Adrian? Do you need me? Or do you just need someone to fix what you couldn't?" She stepped back, the distance between them deeper than the room itself. "I can't breathe in a home where I'll always be someone's mistake." He tried to speak, but his words caught in his throat. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the kind that no apology could heal. Slowly, he nodded and turned away, leaving her in the dim light of the room she now called home. When the door closed, Aisha sank to the floor beside her child, tears falling freely. But somewhere between the heartbreak and the silence, a spark of resolve began to rise. She had been shamed, blamed, and cast aside for the truth too many times. Not again. Not this time. She looked at Noah and whispered, "We're not running anymore. We're going to tell them everything." The pain in her heart hardened into purpose. The same courage that once held her to a window high above the city was now steering her towards something even greater. Justice. And as the night deepened outside, she made a promise to herself. She would return, not as a victim, but as the truth Margaret could no longer bury. The morning air felt heavy with unfinished truths. Aisha stood at the edge of the small park near her apartment, her coat wrapped tightly around her. In her hand, she held a phone with a list of names she had gathered over sleepless nights. People who had once worked in Adrian's household, people who might still remember what others had chosen to forget. Among them was one name that stood out, Josefa, the former housekeeper who had quietly disappeared months after Adrian's wife, Camilla, had died. If anyone knew what really happened, it was her. Aisha found her in a quiet nursing home on the city's outskirts. The woman was older now, her eyes clouded but her memory still sharp. When Aisha mentioned Margaret's name, something in Josefa's face changed. Fear mixed with anger. "You want to know about that woman?" she whispered. "You should. Because people like her don't stop until they've broken everything good around them." Aisha listened as the truth spilled out like a wound finally reopened. Josefa spoke of the years she had worked for the family, of Camilla's growing despair, and of Margaret's constant cruelty. She told Camilla she was weak, unworthy, that Adrian only married her out of pity. Josefa said, voice trembling. Every day she pushed her closer to the edge. The night she died, Camilla wasn't running an errand. She was running away. She called me before she left, crying so hard she could barely breathe. Aisha sat frozen. Her fingers tightened around her phone as she quietly turned on the recorder. "Are you saying Camilla's death wasn't an accident?" she asked softly. Josefa's eyes filled with tears. "It was no accident," she whispered. "It was heartbreak. Margaret killed her with words before the road ever did." Aisha thanked her hands shaking as she stopped the recording. It was the proof she needed, not just for herself, but for Adrian, for Ethan, for every silent wound Margaret had left behind. That evening, when Adrian appeared at her door, he looked nothing like the confident man she once worked for. His shoulders were heavy, his voice rough from sleepless nights. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "I should have believed you. I let doubt make me blind." Aisha didn't speak at first. Instead, she played the recording. As Josefa's trembling confession filled the small apartment, Adrian's expression changed. Disbelief, then pain, then a hollow kind of understanding. When the recording ended, he sat in silence for a long time, staring at the floor. Finally, he said, "It's time everyone hears the truth." The next afternoon, the penthouse that once symbolized power and wealth became the stage for reckoning. Margaret stood near the piano, perfectly composed as usual, unaware of the storm about to break. The guests had gathered, a mix of family, board members, and longtime friends. Adrian's tone was calm but firm as he addressed them. "Before we begin, there's something you all need to hear." He pressed a button, and from the speakers came Josefa's fragile voice, echoing through the marble halls. The room fell still. Her confession carried every word of guilt and sorrow, painting a picture of a woman destroyed not by accident, but by cruelty. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Margaret's face turned pale, then hardened into denial. "Lies," she hissed. "That woman is bitter and old. She's lying to protect herself." But before Adrian could respond, a small voice broke through the tension. It was Ethan. Standing near the stairs, his little hands balled into fists, his eyes brimming with tears. He hadn't spoken in months, but now his voice rang clear and shaking. "You made Mom cry. You made her drive away." The room went silent. Margaret's face drained of color. For the first time, the walls she'd built around herself cracked. No amount of denial could erase the truth spoken by a child. The guests turned away, whispers spreading like wildfire. Margaret reached for Adrian's arm, but he stepped back. "Leave," he said quietly. "You've taken enough from this family." And so the woman who once controlled every room she entered now stood small and powerless, her empire of lies collapsing around her. She left without another word, her footsteps echoing down the marble hall until they faded into nothing. In the stillness that followed, Aisha looked at Ethan, his small frame trembling. Adrian knelt beside him and pulled him into his arms. Aisha joined them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they were whole. Not perfect, but whole. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. Days turned into weeks, and the house began to heal. Ethan laughed again, chasing Noah through the hallways, his voice bright and free. The smell of pancakes returned to the mornings, and Adrian found himself lingering in the kitchen, drawn not by hunger, but by the sound of life. Aisha's presence became the quiet rhythm of their home, steady, gentle, and strong. Months later, spring arrived with soft winds and sunlight spilling through open doors. In a garden filled with white flowers, Adrian stood waiting beneath an arch of blooming lilies. Aisha walked toward him in a simple dress, her smile carrying both grace and history. Ethan stood proudly beside them, holding a small velvet box with the rings. When Adrian took Aisha's hand, it wasn't the beginning of something new. It was the continuation of everything they had fought for. As the ceremony ended and the sun began to set, Aisha knelt beside Noah, who was now toddling on unsteady legs. She whispered softly, "I always was your mom." The woman who once clung to a rope above the city now stood on solid ground, surrounded by love she never thought she deserved. The wind that once howled against the glass towers now carried laughter, the kind that only comes after surviving the storm. Sometimes the people who enter our lives at our lowest aren't there to save us. They're there to remind us how to live again. Love doesn't ask for perfection. It sees the truth and chooses it anyway. And as the garden glowed in the evening light, their story closed not with sorrow, but with the quiet triumph of hearts that had finally found home.